Hello, this is Dr. Michael McCall, and this is the MSN 6302 Neurotransmitter and Hormone Imbalances. Today's our first week of lecture, and this is a really exciting topic for me in general as well as to teach. And a couple things I'd like to remind you of is that this is probably one of the toughest areas to understand is, first of all, neurotransmitters, as I'm sure you guys know, as well as hormones. And to practice this type of medicine or to be cognizant of this type of medicine is basically a lifelong study. In some cases, you will forget the things that you'll learn in this class, and then you will have to remember them as you go to another class or you pursue your studies. And I think that's the norm for all of this. The key is to focus on the things that seem to come easy for you, and if there's some things that you come across that you think is important to you but you may not be able to process them, that's what a library is for. So in this class, it's a 3-hour credit. We generally, to be quite honest, we're not going to have enough time to encompass every part of everything that you need within this subject to be the best functional medicine physician that you can be. But what I want to do is get you in and get you oriented into such a way that maybe we're going to set you up for success. Some of you, it may be the first time. You may have to work a little bit harder. What I would do is find some books that you can reference from. We have 2 of the texts in this class, but what I would highly recommend is maybe go on the internet and or go to a library or go to a bookstore and just scan through things that are that you can take the information in quickly and reference very, very quickly, and that should be your library. For some of you, you may have gone through these types of classes before, and some of this stuff will come really easy, and some of the stuff you'll go, oh, I didn't realize I forgot that. And that's just normal. So a little bit about me is I'm a chiropractor. I got my master's in human nutrition from this program. It's one of the best programs. I had researched it for years. And I practice applied kinesiology, which put me on the map with functional neurology, with functional medicine. In my practice, I treat a lot of things musculoskeletally. In fact, I love to do adjusting. I really think it's a phenomenal way of helping people. However, I feel these days we have a population of patients that are getting sicker and sicker, and they're harder to fix. And one of those reasons is their biochemistry has been abused just by living in the American lifestyle. So eating food-like substances exposed to more toxins than ever before. And so I tend to get a lot of chronic musculoskeletal pain where chiropractic or physical therapy or these things aren't responding like they should. And so we have to turn over a few stones and fix some of these patients. And a lot of it has to do with hormones and in some cases neurotransmitters. So I love this quote by Lonnie Jarrett. Wrote a really good book called Nourish and Destiny. If some of you guys are acupuncturists, you might have come across this. It's a great quote. So all models of medicine are based on scientific systems, which in turn are predicated on a cultural's assumption about the fundamentals, nature of existence. And the reason why I have this slide is we're going to be talking this week about plasticity. And plasticity within the scope of medicine is really a very new topic. In fact, in the 1990s and early 2000, this was a really interesting topic that actually hit my chiropractic college when I graduated. And back at that time, the paradigm was once the brain had developed as an adult, the nerves were what you had. You didn't get any more nerves, and the nerves didn't change. You were already hardwired. But plasticity came along, and it changed all that. So all the information prior to that was based on a model that was what medicine had accepted. And then with plasticity, it changed that. So even today, as you're studying, you have to understand that our medicine model is derived by how our culture looks at reality. And if we have a fundamental change in reality, we may have a fundamental change in medicine. And I think that's what you're in the middle of right now with this program, is you're seeing a change, which I think is really exciting. This slide is just basically an outline to the left of the things that we're going to cover today. We're going to be talking about just a quick anatomical review, and we're going to really go into neuroplasticity, and we're also going to go a couple steps back. We're going to talk about how a nerve fires and how that alters the expression of the neurotransmitters, and how to keep a healthy nerve functioning, especially for your patients, but more importantly for yourself. If you can fix yourself, you're going to fix a lot of patients. Here's the overview of the brain. It's broken up into these lobes, very basic neuroanatomy. What I want to go over is the brainstem anatomy and cover some things that we'll probably be covering a little bit later. So I'm circling around right here. This is your hypothalamus, and this is the paraventricular nucleus, and this is an important step in the hormone aspect to our classes that we're going to be learning. So the first 3 weeks we're going to be covering neurotransmitters, and week 4 we start the HPA axis, the hypopituitary axis, and then we're going to go right into more of endocrinology. Okay. So in this slide, as we go down here, we have an impulse coming up the spine. So information is coming from the body, and it synapses right here. This is through the brain stem into the hypothalamus, and then there is this cluster of nerve cells. The hypothalamus reads this information, and what it does is it releases hormones into the pituitary, causing the pituitary to release stimulating hormones to whatever endocrine gland needs to be stimulated. Say it's the adrenal glands, or it is the ovaries, the pancreas, these types of things. That's what happens. Further on, you're going to notice that there's 2 sections to the pituitary. There's the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary, if you see this line, it's a direct nerve integration. But here in the anterior pituitary, hormone is released into the circulatory system within the pituitary. And then from there it'll stimulate the release of hormones. If you come down here in this lower slide, you'll see that there is this nerve coming from the spinal cord. This is the spinal cord, cut in sections. And what it's saying is, as the brain sends a signal into the pituitary to release hormones, it also goes down the brainstem, catches a couple other switch plate guys, and that's technical, and as it comes right down into the spinal cord, and at the spinal cord it synapses into the sympathetic chain. And in this case, they're saying the sympathetic chain goes into the adrenal medulla. So the signal goes down the spinal cord into the sympathetic nervous system, and and from there what happens is you get a release of hormone within, in this example, the adrenals. This is a blow-up section of the hypothalamus. So here's your pituitary right here. And then these are all the various nuclei of the hypothalamus. Now, very basically, the best way I know how to describe the hypothalamus, it is literally the switch plate of everything that you experience as a human being. So all the nerves have to go from the body into the brain. This is called the afferents. The afferent nerves. You have 5 times more afferent nerves than you do efferent nerves. So it means your nervous system is geared more towards information coming to the brain than the brain telling the body what to do. I'll say that again. You have more nerves in your body that are basically sensory than you do an action. I find that fascinating. So you have all these nuclei that have specific activities that they do, and here we have the paraventricular one that we mentioned. So this is water retention, which is related to the adrenal glands. Okay, and they all have an influence on the pituitary and works its way. So the hypothalamus in itself is really the switch plate. So all your chemical aspects that are in the blood, all your nervous system information, your emotions, temperature, all those things that your body picks up goes right to the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is really your epicenter of how your body regulates itself. So I call it the switch plate. I'm not the only one. A lot of people do too. Okay, so this is a cross section of the spinal cord. So information comes from the brain. Once the brain has processed that information, it goes down the spinal cord. And very basic spinal cord anatomy. Here is your dorsal horn, and the dorsal horn is the horn that all the sensory information of the body comes through here. So these are the spinal nerves that come into the body, synapse with the spinal cord, and go up to the brain. And it's in the posterior part, or the dorsal. Dorsal means back. So if some of you may not have those terms with anatomy. So here we are looking at a cross section of a spinal cord, and if a patient was standing, this would be their back, and this would be where their face pointing forward. You have a ventral horn, and this is where, if you go over to the left here, we have our alpha motor neurons. These are the nerves that synapse with our muscles and cause muscle contraction. The gamma motor neurons are also go into the gamma motors, and those gamma motors are within the muscle cell itself. And it is a complicated process where the body can know exactly how to contract a muscle by how well the spindles in the gamma motor neurons fire. Okay, so the gamma motor neurons set the tone of a muscle. If you didn't have those, you just fall down to the floor. The gamma motor neurons helps the brain know exactly how much tension should be in the muscle. And you have the intermediate horn. Okay, this next part is somewhat important, but you won't be tested on it, but somewhat important. So your sympathetic chain that we alluded to before is like a parallel spine or a spinal cord. You have two sets on either side. They lay right on outside the bodies of the vertebra. The sympathetic chain exits from T1, that's your first thoracic. You have 12 thoracics. It exits from each one of those all the way down to L2. You have 5 lumbar vertebrae, and in between the vertebrae is where the nerves exit from the spinal cord. So the sympathetic chain originates out of T1 through L2. That's what that slide is. Okay. So if just from a functional medicine perspective, how chiropractic fits there, if you have a joint out of place, or you have inflammation around the spinal cord because of a subluxation, which is a joint that's not quite dislocated but out of place, it can, as you can tell, there's going to be some type of influence on the way the body can process and information, as well as communicate that information. All right, and here's an example of how the sympathetic works. So here is a blood vessel that goes into the brain. So the sympathetic chain, what it does is it's part of your fight and flight. It's part of your autonomic nervous system. That's what this ANS is. And you have two sides of your autonomic nervous system. You have the sympathetic chain, which we're talking about, and you have the parasympathetic chain. The sympathetic chain is part of your fight and flight. It is what gears your body to be more active, to run, to get a heightened sense of arousal. The parasympathetic is more of calming, more of relaxation. The parasympathetic helps stimulates your digestive tract, so it makes it more active. And the sympathetic will shut down the organ systems and shunt the blood to the muscles. So the sympathetic chain will shunt the blood from the deep viscera into the muscles. The parasympathetic shunts the blood out of the muscles into the viscera. So it's that interplay that that's in the background of our everyday existence. So in this case, we have once again this cross section of the spinal cord. Information's coming down from the brain, and information's coming from the body up to the brain through that dorsal horn. And then right here is your ventral horn. Remember we mentioned that before, and that's where the sympathetics come out. And this is that chain that I was mentioning. Okay, so that sympathetic nerve can go directly from the spinal cord all the way here, follow this area, and here we go. We call it the splenic nerve. Splenic nerve is the sympathetic nerve that goes right to the adrenals. So you have a direct. The adrenal gland is exceptional in the sense that it gets direct sympathetic nerve supply from the spinal cord. Most of the other organs in your body have a secondary one. You have pre-ganglionic cells, which means the nerve that runs from the spinal cord to the ganglion. This is a ganglion right here, this cluster. This is a ganglion as well. This is a node. This is a ganglion as well. Okay? And so a lot of times the nerve will come through and it can go right to the adrenals like we talked about, but it can also come up and go up or down to a sympathetic prevertebral ganglion. So it'll snaps here, and then once it snaps here, it may go into an organ. And that's generally how it works. So when you talk about the sympathetic chain and the parasympathetics, a lot of times you will talk about the pre-ganglionic nerve and the post-ganglionic nerve. There's generally two nerves that come from the spinal cord. So you'll see that in your further studies if you explore that. Okay? Now, as you know, you can't have any kind of neurotransmitter release unless the nerve fires. And we're going to do a little quick review of the action potential. I have found that YouTube is fantastic when I went through this program, by the way. If you have anything that you needed to kind of get a grasp on, I would go to YouTube, look at the lectures. Sometimes you just have to hear it differently from another instructor to really get the information into your head. Or, they have great videos that just shows you how the dynamics of everything plays out. So I highly recommend that you just YouTube it if you haven't done it already. And in fact, if anyone wants to please, any of the information from this slide that they want to share, maybe they already have that information, please post it on the forum. Hey, that's a point, and that'll be great because it really helps to get as much information as you can to really get your neurons firing in your brain to keep this information relevant to you and your patients. So in this slide, if you look at the top slide, it shows you that little box and it comes out and it just shows you what the concentration is of these molecules. And as you can see, the cytosol, which is the inside of the cell, and the extracellular fluid is there. And if you look at just an example, the potassium, the Na+, you notice that there's less sodium within the nerve cell, and there's 10 times more outside the cell. And it's that resting potential, meaning that difference between the two, that sets up the resting potential, where it just sets the nerve up to get ready to fire. And as you learned before, nature doesn't like a gradient. It would rather have everything in balance, but what makes that gradient the way it is the sodium, potassium, ATP pumps, which requires a lot of ATP, which requires a lot of mitochondria. So as you know, the nerves, the muscles, the kidneys, the liver, the heart, are areas of the body with high concentrations of mitochondria. And one of the things that I really enjoyed going through this program was how a lot of these chronic issues that we're having go all the way down to the cellular level, all the way to the mitochondria. So if there's any kind of gross or pan-epidemic mitochondrial issues, you're going to find patients with some type of symptoms within those tissues, either the nervous system, the heart, the muscles, which is fatigue, which is one of the biggest things you'll see in practice, is everybody's just tired. And foggy thinking is usually what you see mostly. People can't sleep is another thing. Falling asleep in the afternoon. These are things that probably some of you are seeing this right now, but you'll see this in practice. It's probably one of the biggest things that you'll see. So we have a resting potential. Now the slide below is showing myelinated sheets. And what makes those sheets are your Schwann cells. Okay? And the myelinization of an axon allows the nerve to fire much more efficiently, much quicker. So your alpha motor neurons, which are your muscles, are wrapped in myelin sheaths, and that's why you can react so quickly up to that. And I'm assuming you guys have already been through this, especially when we did the sports exercise one. We went through that pretty pretty much. And we're, like I said, we're not going to be covering this too much. I just want to review how this affects neurotransmitters. And also, this is also ties into what we're going to be talking about later, plasticity. So this is just showing you the diagram of the action potential. I put this slide in here because I think it will help as I talk about things. So here's your resting potential. This is what it looks like on the diagram. Depolarization starts to happen right here. So what happens is with depolarization is the receptor to this particular cell, it has enough stimulus that gets it ramped up. Once it's reached the threshold, so we're at -70 millivolts, once it reaches the threshold, the gates open, the kraken is released. And what happens is now that extracellular sodium starts pouring into the cell, and it creates a change in the charge. And if you can see from this diagram, you have it's positive on the outside, negative on the inside. We get a change. We're getting a depolarization of the cell, which propagates all the way down the axon of a nerve, and you get this. But once it reaches positive 40, the gates are altered again, and the action potential is lowered down here. Good. And then what happens is the whole process starts again with the resting potential. So you can review the slides, go to YouTube, do that over and over. I've been forgetting and remembering this many times over the last 20 years. So here we go. We're going to get a little bit more in depth here. So what we're seeing in this slide is the synapsis of a nerve. And let me get my notes out for this one. There's a couple of things here that I definitely want to bring up that are going to tie this talk together. So now that we're talking, these points, these words that I'm going to use next are basically in reference to each other. So you have your synaptic cleft. It's the space between the two nerves. You have a presynaptic nerve, which is this, and then here's your postsynaptic nerve. Okay, so the presynaptic nerve is the one that releases the neurotransmitter in this example, and the postsynaptic nerve is the one that takes the neurotransmitter in, and it is changing its function because of it. Okay, so the very top of here is just showing, yes, we know that the nerve makes these neurotransmitters. Okay, and they put them together, but what happens is the nerve doesn't let these guys float around. What they do is they package them into vesicles. So it's the packaging part of this aspect. But what's interesting here is the degraded enzymes. If these neurotransmitters are not in the vesicles, the body will actually degrade those, meaning that they will break them down to the basic building blocks and put them back up here again. And the reason for this is neurotransmitters, as well as hormones, and as well as there's some key enzymes. The cells don't have them activated. They keep them in an inactive state. And the more powerful the chemical agent, and the chemical agent is incorporating hormones, neurotransmitters, and enzymes in this example of my talk, the more the body protects itself. Now, just to give you an example, when a woman goes through her monthly cycle and the estrogen is at its height, and estrogen means it's Greek for frenzy, by the way. I find that interesting. You know, medicine's been dominated by men. They really can be misogynist, but it's a frenzy. That particular reaction, the dilution of that, or how much chemicals affecting it, is basically what a woman goes through with that cycle. Is just think of 8 boxcars of water and putting 1 drop of estrogen in there. That's it. So estrogen, if you can just get that concept in your head, is a very powerful agent. That's 1 drop in 8 boxcars of water dilution that creates the changes of the human body. Mind-blowing to me. Okay, so basically, generally they store things in vesicles. If they don't store them, then they put them in an inactive state. Okay, so as the action potential comes down the presynaptic nerve, and what happens is it causes that vesicle to move closer to the edge. And what's interesting is the vesicles basically fuse with the membrane of the cell. So this is like a mini membrane, and it fuses with it, which is interesting. And then it releases the neurotransmitter. Okay. In order for that to happen, though, and it's not in the slide, you have to have calcium channels. The calcium will connect to the vesicle itself, and if that calcium can connect, that allows the fusion. If you don't have calcium, this neurotransmitter will not be released. So here we can talk about a patient with Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or something, pathological, meaning that you can see something on an X-ray, MRI, or some kind of test. And it could have been years of maybe they were not assimilating calcium. So when we talk about neurotransmitters, it's so exciting to talk about things on that level, but it could be something really basic and simple that keeps that patient from expressing their full expression as a human being through their nervous system because the neurotransmitter isn't working. So if you don't have calcium, you don't have this vesicle fusing to this nerve cell, and then you don't get a release of the neurotransmitter. So here it is. It's in the synaptic cleft. Now, if this cell releases so much hormone and there's no receptor for it, you get zip, no change, dead phone on the end, no reaction. But since this postsynaptic nerve has some receptors and they synapse, generally think of this as now this is the receptor, and that in itself causes the gradient response and the action potential and a change in that. Okay, now. Right here, number 7 is a really important point that I'd like you guys to understand. So I'm going to read the slide. Released neurotransmitter molecules are deactivated either by reuptake or enzyme degradation, which that means is in every synaptic cleft when it happens, especially for any neurotransmitter, there's a competition going on. There's a competition of enough neurotransmitters to float across that synapse and to reach the receptor of the postsynaptic cell. But at the same time, there's enzymes in there and receptors in there that take the neurotransmitter out. Okay, they deactivate it or they reuptake it. They mean they take it out of that synapse quick. It's like it's a vacuum. It sucks it out. And it's that interplay between the two that gives us the normal physiology that we have today. So as you know, a Prozac, which was the original serotonin reuptake inhibitor, is a drug that blocks those receptors for reuptake. So the patient is not making more neurotransmitter to get them out of that depressed state. What's happening is that neurotransmitter is staying in the synaptic cleft longer to create that effect. Now, if as a functional medicine doc, I can't express it enough that you're always going to have to ask questions. And I think the best question to always start with is, why would the body do that? Okay? So why would the body do that? And one of the reasons is that the body never uses the same neurotransmitter or hormone twice. And once again, these strong chemical agents that we've talked about, which I say are enzymes, neurotransmitters, and hormones, are so powerful, and if they alter in any way molecularly or maybe even energetically, maybe the charge is off slightly, the body doesn't like that. It will take the neurotransmitter out of that synaptic cleft and it will break it down to its most basic amino acids and components and rebuild it again. So it never uses the same neurotransmitter and hormone twice. Same thing with the hormones. The liver takes out the estrogen, breaks it down completely, makes what it can, sends what it can to areas that can make it more refined, and it's stored again. So the body works hard to not have that. So imagine that we have people taking these reuptake inhibitors that are altering this particular aspect, and I think that might be one of the reasons why we're seeing that, yes, it does help, but it causes a lot of problems as well. Okay, and I also find it we'll talk about that later. Okay, so these are the readings. We're going to review the signal transduction. The chapters that you're going to be reading in the functional medicine text is here. And you have 3 receptors, basic receptors. The first one is the receptor tyrosine kinases, which is your insulin receptors, okay, which you're going to be reading about. And the test is on this. Just letting you know, the little quiz we're having this week. You have the G protein coupled receptors. Very complicated mechanisms that are in there. Once again, you'll probably learn it, forget it, learn it, forget it a million times. And the hormones that are reflecting are prolactin, glucagon. And we're not going to be covering those per se in the class. but just know that aspect. And these are some areas where they're targeting cancer therapy. Okay, and then what we're going to be covering in this class a little bit more are going to be the nuclear hormone receptor superfamily. So with the receptor tyrosine kinases and the G protein coupled receptors, they are integrating at the membrane of the cell only. Okay. With the nuclear hormone receptor superfamily, they're reacting at the membrane, but they're taking the signal or the chemical through the nucleus membrane and directly affecting how DNA is transcribed. So cortisol, estradiol, testosterone are part of your steroid hormones that are made in the adrenal glands, as well as, estradiol and testosterone are made in the ovaries and testes, but the adrenals also make estradiol. They also make testosterone as well. So it feeds into that membrane. It goes into the nuclear membrane, and what it does is these are powerful hormones. If you think it's going into our genetic library, and it's making the cells make certain proteins to change the body fundamentally. Very amazing. Also, you have thyroxine, vitamin A and D. As you can see, cortisol, estradiol, and testosterone, those are steroid hormones. Steroid hormones are cholesterol-based, so the basic building block of those hormones is cholesterol. So you need that fat and you need that cholesterol to get through that membrane. And as you know through some of the classes you've taken, is if you get the right essential fatty acids, it makes the membrane more flexible. With a more flexible membrane, you have a more healthier cell. So, and vitamin A and vitamin D, as you know, are fat-soluble vitamins. So I find that fascinating. Okay, so let's talk with this slide. This slide is important because it's going to be setting up our concept of plasticity, as well as we're going to review, once again, the action potential. So we are showing someone being adjusted, and we say it's a stretch response. As you impulse through the bone, you're going to get stretch responses in the ligaments, muscles, tendons, and nerves. And it's a graded potential, meaning that here is a receptor here. That the receptor has a gradient. It can fire up higher or lower. It changes. As you get to the action potential, as we saw before, the action potential does not have a gradient. It's between -7 and -70 millivolts and positive 40 millivolts. And it doesn't vary. It's always within that realm. Okay. So in this example, we have a stretch response, an adjustment. It has reached threshold. That's what that dotted line is. So once the threshold starts, then what happens is we get an action potential down the axon. This long thing here is called an axon. And here is your myelinated sheets right here, the myelinated axon. Okay. And what happens is it creates an action potential. So what you do is you have a stress, say you have some type of stimulus in the body, and it creates an action potential. And here we're just showing that you have a neurotransmitter release. Okay. Now this right here is part of the neuroplasticity that we're going to get to. So that CIEG, which is part of your reading in those abstracts that you're reading, is the cellular immediate early gene response. And what that means is, as we start to get stimulus from one nerve to the next, not only does it cause an action potential, but it also causes the nucleus of that nerve cell to change its protein production at the DNA level. So with each propagation, you're going to get a change in the nucleus where it starts to express different genes to make this cell much more efficient in how it deals with the nerve before. Okay. So what's interesting about those readings you have is, neuroplasticity, like I was saying, it was just being taught at the school when I was there in late 1990s, early 2000, and it was always about the postsynaptic cell. What's interesting about those abstracts you're reading this week, they're finally going, hey, let's look at the presynaptic. How does that contribute to nerves becoming more efficient, or what overall creates the concept of plasticity? So as you do those readings, what they're saying is, well, the presynaptic nerve is actually releasing these proteins that basically make the next makes those connections much more efficient. So anyway, that's what you're reading this week. Okay. So what we're going to do is, well, what dictates how much neurotransmitter is being emitted? Say a patient has a low neurotransmitter, but their cells are making enough of it. You have to get that neurotransmitter working. What are some things that can alter that on a cellular nerve level? And that's what we're talking about here. So this is just a copy of the slide that we saw before. So what we're going to focus on is right here. How much of a stimulus will change how much neurotransmitter is going out, as well as how long is that stimulus maintained also dictates how long that how much neurotransmitter is being produced. Okay, so in this example, we're having more of the stronger impulse of the receptor. So you can see we're raising up this graded potential. It's graded, okay, because once again, the action potential is not graded, but the action potential has to reflect the gradient of the impulse, and this is what we're going to be discussing in the slide. Okay, so as we increase this graded potential, it causes more action potentials to go off. So meaning that the nerve cell is more frequent in the action potential. It's just going up and down, up and down, up and down between -70 and 40, much more frequently. As the action potential is more frequency, then that nerve will release more neurotransmitter. That's what this slide is trying to show you. However, you can create more neurotransmitter also by how long that receptor or how long that activation between those two nerves are, which is this. So here in this example, we're showing both amplitude and duration. So what's happening is now that signal is that receptor impulse is longer in time. And what that does in this example is, compared to the first one, is it's increasing the amplitude and it's increasing the duration. And then this interface between the gradient and the action potentials here. So now we have the nerve firing much more frequently and longer, and it has a net release of more neurotransmitters is right here. So what's important in this slide is the gradient potential doesn't change. It's always the same. The only thing that it does to correlate with the impulse is the frequency, and basically that's it. How frequently it goes for how long. Okay. Now, because there's more of this happening, this basically is the impetus for what we're going to be talking about further in our lecture is plasticity. Okay. So here we are looking at, in this case, let's just say that this is the second order neuron or the postsynaptic neuron. What's going on the nuclear level? What's going on with its physiology? So here we go. We have the impulse. We have more neurotransmitter coming into this nerve, which causes this nerve to be stimulated. So you have an increase in the kinase activation, and then you have an increase in the cellular immediate early gene response right here. Okay, and what it does is, in your readings you'll see, is that the CFOS, the GUN, and the MAR are names for genes. These genes transcribe and cause that cell to increase its mitochondrial function. Okay, it also causes this cell to release proteins that make synaptogenesis happening, meaning that you're creating more synapses between the nerves because they're having a relationship. Okay, you meet a friend, you may get their Facebook account, then all of a sudden you get their email address, and then all of a sudden you get their telephone number. You develop different lines of communication to be more efficient to get in touch with that person. Okay. It also these proteins increases plasticity, which we're going to go over, and then long-term potentiation. This is an interesting concept. What that means is, is when the presynaptic nerve releases that neurotransmitter and it's constantly being stressed, it's constantly being expressed, what happens is the secondary cell, the postsynaptic cell, will fire more frequently as less neurotransmitters being released, so it becomes more efficient. So the secondary nerve will fire longer, and it'll build up that relationship. So what's happening is your nervous system, in essence, is becoming more efficient. It needs less stimulus to create a greater result because of the frequency of how many times one nerve is talking to each other. It also causes the nerve to release more neurotransmitter because of neurotransmitter production, and it upregulates the second neuron. So the next guy down the line, say neuron number 3, it releases those proteins that makes that connection happen. Okay. Now here's the next part that is really important, is it also causes the secondary neuron to make more receptors. So if you have more receptors in the cell for the neurotransmitter, remember that competition between the receptors and the reuptake? Then this cell is going to be more successful in capturing more neurotransmitters. As you increase the neurotransmitters, you increase basically the receptor impulse. Okay. And now if this nerve is going to get oxygen, glucose, fat, and protein, it becomes a very healthy nerve. Okay. Which is right here. Okay, so the more that the nervous tissue is stimulated, actually it becomes much more healthier and more efficient cell. Okay, so here we go. Review. We have a frequency of firing. It affects a cellular immediate early gene response. Receptors turn genes on. So we're seeing that not just this impulse goes through, but this causes the nerve to become more efficient, creates more protein, creates more receptors, and it makes itself much more responsive to the nerve before. It increases the number of mitochondria for abundant energy. As you know, you increase the mitochondria in any cell, it's a happy cell, as long as the mitochondria are healthy. We don't want to create all that reactive oxygenase species that we learned about. Increases the receptor sites, and increases the amount of neurotransmitter that's made. The axonal arborization means that the cells will start to, as they become more efficient, the mitochondria is doing, will start building more connections, meaning that the nerves will start creating more axons, connecting it to that next nerve. So it stimulates the nerve cell to create more axons and to have much more bridges to make that communication. In fact, if you guys can go back, I know the school has that when we had last year before the symposium in the International Symposium of Human Nutrition and Functional Medicine. Dr. Hasse, who used to teach this class, has a video. It's showing nerves actually moving and making those connections. That's the first time I've ever seen that. And then, of course, overall, you got a healthy, more stable cell, and it has greater endurance and strength. Okay. Here's a book on plasticity that you can read. This is an interesting. Plasticity allows us to talk about how mind-body medicine works, how thoughts affect us, how people become hardwired, how people can learn new things. It creates a great stage that can connect many different aspects to physiology, where in most cases it couldn't before, because with the old model, once the brain was hardwired, there were so many exceptions to that rule that it created the need for neuroplasticity and a better paradigm. So, okay. So we're now on neuroplasticity. Donald Hebb coined the term neurons that fire together, wire together. And he was one of the great pioneers to give us this model. Eric Kandel also added some work onto this. And so here what we're gonna do is now we're gonna move out of the cellular level and talk about how, being a human being, how you will see neuroplasticity happen. Okay. So in this example, we have this is going to be a pitcher, and the initial response is that batter comes to the plate. Now this pitcher got to be a pitcher because he practiced very hard. So as he was practicing throwing a ball over and over and over and over, his nervous system, his cells, were learning how to fire together, because plasticity is not only about making those connections stronger, it's nerves are literally moving in your nervous system and making connections. So if you're throwing a baseball, you're thinking, your eyes are looking at the target, and then you have to coordinate your whole body to take that ball to that target. There is many different nervous system aspects. You have your spatial information coming in from the eyes. You have your proprioceptive receptors to know where your body is in space when you make that throw. You have to coordinate your legs and arms and everything. You got to keep your head straight. You have to keep good form. With a better form, the more successful you will become to put the ball where you want it. So what we have is you just focus on the blue arrows. You have the batter standing up. You've learned that wind up. You practiced it over and over. You got to do that wind up in a certain way, because what happened is you learned as you became more successful, that's how you should do it. And then you start to throw the ball, which is B, and as the ball is being thrown, your body mechanics, how it goes, where your foot lands, all that stuff is taken into account because you practiced it. And you follow through with the ball, and you change your wrist and your fingers slightly, and that's where you can get past the batter and strike, and you've become successful. Well, that happened with practice, but what really happened on the nerve level was that your nervous system was making these bridges to make that smoother. Okay, so follow this cursor, so you have success. But what's happening is everything feeds back. So say I didn't do my wind-up great and the ball was off. That was negative. My nervous system and I went, whoa, that didn't work. So what I need to do is I need to work on that wind-up. So you finally do the wind-up and it was successful. Well, that feeds back into the process and goes, that's going to be hardwired. So you literally, as you practice, you're basically building these neurological nets or plexuses. And this what makes it more efficient for you to do what you do. Okay, so a better example for me would be, you learn how to play guitar. You're basically have the music in your head. That's one part of your brain. You have to coordinate your hand, which is going to be your cerebellum, which is your fine-tuning, not so jerky type of motion, plus your cerebrum, and you're also trying to get the timing right. So as you're trying to strum that guitar and trying to make it happen, all of a sudden you hit that note and you're like, ooh, and you go, you do it again, and then you reproduce, and finally you can do it more efficiently, because what's happening is you literally have neurons connecting and going, I got this. So say you finally get to play through a song and you practice that song and song. You don't even have to think about it, because what's happening is literally the nerves in your brain and spinal cord and everything are making those connections for you, physically making those connections. So you get to the point where you're just killing the song, and all of a sudden you can look around the room and you can have a conversation with somebody playing. What's happening is that neural net has finally gotten developed at its height. And what happens with neuroplasticity, which is also interesting, is that neural net finally goes, you know what? I don't need so many nerves. These guys are, right now, they're firing so well together, that efficiency between those two nerves are working so well that the 6 nerves to make that happen don't have to work. So now what happens is your nervous system says, oh, you need less nerves to handle on this action, because the nerves that are there already are so efficient. Now we have these nerves dedicated to whatever you want to learn next. Fascinating. So a review of plasticity. Another example is Dr. Leon. He says it's a lot like a snow-covered hill. So this was more of I'm talking to you more about how to practice. He's talking more about our habits. And right here, Bruce Lipton is somebody that you guys should read. He wrote The Biology of Belief. He's on YouTube. Fascinating researcher. He was a pathologist, and what got him on his groove is that he would be looking at cells and for pathology, and he had this group of cells that he would find, I think it was for some disease, and he would look at it, and then the next day the cells were healed, and he couldn't understand what the heck that was. And he kept asking questions like we all should, and he finally got to the point was that these cells are actually healthier if they're outside of this body. And that led him into realizing that maybe this patient, he found out the patient was depressed, and that these cells were not in a good environment. So that's when he knew that, what we think can affect our cellular processes. Another aspect is Dr. Emoto wrote a book called The Molecules of, what is it? He did a study on how water molecules are affected by emotions. I wish I could remember what that text is. If you guys ever get to see that movie, What the Bleep Do We Know? It's a pretty good movie on how it's kind of like The Secret, but it had a really cool animation about how emotions affect ourselves. So if you ever get a chance to look at that movie, that'd be interesting. So back to Dr. Leon. He's saying, a lot of this is like these neuropathways is if, say, you live in a snow part of the country. I grew up in Pennsylvania and then Georgia, but when you have snow and you got to walk long distances, you always want to go where the snow is packed because it's less work. But say the snow falls and I have to get to school and I walk. Well, as I take that walk, I'm walking in fresh snow. That's the beginning of plasticity. And the next day I wake up, I walk in my same footprints because it's much easier. And over time, I basically get a groove between my school and my home. And that's where they say it becomes a little more hardwired. But say I want to take a different path, well, I have to cut through all that again. So what he's saying at the very bottom is there's a paradox to plasticity. It can produce flexible behaviors. You can learn new things, but it also makes you more rigid. Like, if you want to be better at something, a lot of times, like I do jiu-jitsu, you do an armbar a certain way, but you can't, for some reason, you can't get anybody in the armbar. And then you go to a coach and he goes, hey, you need to get your knee here and you got to get so you got to relearn those neural pathways. If any of you play sports, you know that. If you want to get better, you kind of have to take your old habits, get rid of them to become better at what you do. Okay, so here's a review of transneural degeneration. So the process of neoplasticity is actually the process of getting a healthy cell. So you can actually get a healthy nervous system by activity, and that's what we're trying to say, because one of the old things that are said in nerve cells is if you don't use it, you'll lose it. If you put a patch over your eye for a period of time, you'll get to the point where that eye will no longer work. Well, you will be permanently blind, because what's happening is the nervous system needs constant stimulation. And the more variance the stimulation, the healthier your brain's going to be. So just keep that in mind. If you have patients that are depressed, you got to get them doing something different. Of course, they don't want to do anything, but you got to find one thing that they somewhat enjoy, and they need to focus on that. And believe me, it sounds pretty easy for you as a physician, but when you're in a depressed state, you need someone to tell you what you already know. And a lot of times that'll help pop a patient out and get their life back in order. You'd be surprised the power of just those words. So here we go. We got decreased oxidation, phosphorylation. We're talking about mitochondria. If the mitochondria aren't working, as you guys know, that is not a healthy cell. If you have decreased ATP, you decrease your energy. Every point of the cell's affected, as we saw in the slides. If that's the case, you don't have enough energy to make more protein. Okay, decreases. Your cellular immediate early gene response decreases, so that cell is not becoming efficient in its firing, and you can't make proteins. So that cell's just on its way out. Sodium potassium pumps fail, and now you have a change in the sodium and potassium equilibrium. Okay, another thing about the sodium potassium pumps, say we have someone with depression, and say, or anything. If you have a deficiency pandemic, it just depends on where the weakest link in that patient is to be expressed. So if your adrenal glands, well, you don't know that, maybe some of you do, your adrenal glands release a hormone called aldosterone, and aldosterone tells the kidneys, hold on to sodium, get rid of the potassium. It's part of the fight or flight. Now imagine if that patient has been stressed for so long and the aldosterone starts to lower, then those kidneys don't hold in the sodium as much, so you pee it out. So now, as you can tell, what we've learned from the action potential, that's definitely going to affect the action potential. So that nerve may be making plenty of neurotransmitter, and it may be making, the secondary nerve may be making a lot of receptors, but if that action potential, as you saw in those slides, isn't efficient because of that gradient is not being maintained, you're going to have a problem with that patient. So, medicine had talked about hypertension for a long time and get people off of sodium, but what you're also doing is you're causing that action potential to be affected in some way. Body's going to be looking for it in some way. So as the sodium Sodium is hydrophilic. It holds water in. If your body can keep sodium in, it'll keep water in. So people that have an adrenal problem, one of the signs and symptoms is they have frequent urination. Water goes right through me, doc, is one of the things that you'll see. So if you can get the body eating, getting the sodium and looking to see what's creating the stress in the body that's making that those adrenals done, you're basically on the pathway of being a functional medicine doc. Okay, so the nucleus isn't making enough tubulin. Tubulin is a protein that basically helps the connection between the synapses of those two cells. As you know from before, you become anaerobic. And anaerobic, what's great about being human is you can function anaerobically, but you're not going to do well. You create more acid. With more acid, lower pH, you're going to cause degradation of the cells much more readily. You're going to get retrograde chromatolysis, which is the axons become weaker. The cell can't repair itself. It cannot create more neurotransmitters. Sodium influx activates neuroproteases, phospholipase, which liberates the arachidonic acid fleet. So we're getting inflammation. So if anything in this program, it all comes down to inflammation, doesn't it? And in a very basic way, and this is a great way to explain it to patients, and it's a great way to explain it to yourself as a physician, is inflammation is the body's attempt to fix itself. And the reason why the body gets inflamed is because the subtle systems that helps the body deal with stress are breaking down. And when that happens, the body will just create inflammation. And if you get any textbook on pathology that's out there and you read every single thing about any named dis-ease of any body, the first stage of all these things is inflammation. So I don't, you can have a neurotransmitter problem, but if you suspect there's inflammation somewhere, you have got to fix the inflammation before you even go to a neurotransmitter. You may be giving them things that will help them with the neurotransmitter, but if you don't get to that underlying inflammatory issue, that stressor, you're not going to help the patient at all. You have to get to that. So inflammation is the first thing that you should really be looking into. And as you know, through our program, it can be from anything, dysbiosis, food allergies, you name it, toxicity, you name it. So just remember that. All right, so now we're going to look at something slightly different, but we've stressed on it before. You have the central integration state. You have the summation. So basically is it too little, too much? Okay, like I said, if you don't use it, you will lose it. If you don't, working out. You work out, you get pretty good, and say you have to lay off for about 6 months, and then you try to lift that weight again, and you realize you can't. You're like, my God, this is heavy. But if you keep with the workout, probably in about 2 weeks, you're almost right back to where you were at your height. And what happened was you didn't develop muscles that quickly. What you did is you got your reflexes between the muscle and the brain functioning. So that strength that you have was how well those neurons were firing. Okay, that's a great example of this. But too much stimulus will destroy the nerves too. One of the sayings in chiropractic by the original guys is, the state of health of the nervous system is its tone. So tone is basically the balance between that. And they suspected that it wasn't too little tone, it was too much tone. We were becoming too stimulated. So too much excitement, as you guys know, can affect it as well. Okay, so if the nervous system isn't being stimulated, you're going to have neurodegeneration. If it's being stimulated, you're going to have neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is what you want. You definitely don't want neurodegeneration. Okay, and sensory stimulus. So if you can keep your body stimmed, you're going to be healthy. And in fact, there's some areas of the brain which we won't talk about, but that are shared. They share nuclear bodies. So there can be a part for short-term memory, and it's also the part shared by lifting your arm up. And if you lift your arm up 100 times and it stimulates those clusters of nerves, it thereby will spill into different areas of what those nerves are dedicated to. So massage, manipulation, exercise, acupuncture, therapy is really how it works. But once again, your massage, manipulation, exercise, acupuncture, these are all stimulation of the body into the brain. If the brain doesn't get stimulation, it can't react. If I do a nerve block from the nerves that are taking information from my muscles to my brain, I've paralyzed my nerves, even though the connection between my brain and my muscles is intact. So the signal from my brain to my muscles, they will not move because the brain needs that sensory information to fire. It will not fire unless it gets that. So that's why these types of treatments help on that level. There's other levels that they help as well. But just an example with neurotransmitters as well as nervous system health. That's it. So color therapy, sound therapy, these are stimuluses that are stimulating the nerve. As the nerve gets stimulated, you're going to increase the ATP fuel, O2, oxygen activation as well. And right here with the mind-body medicine, which is an amazing class, taught very well. I couldn't believe how much great information came out of that class for me. Meditation, prayer, visualization, because even though you think your thoughts are your own, your brain reacts to your thoughts. Your body reacts to what you're thinking. You can take athletes and they can envision themselves doing whatever they do. Say it was a pole vaulter, and they hook electrodes to those muscles. Well, they will get increased electric activity in those muscles in the same pattern as if that person was actually doing that particular activity. So if what you're thinking, your body will react to. And this had always been kind of, yeah, we know that's possible. Yeah, that could be it. But now, I mean, with the research that's coming out now, it is profoundly fundamental. So you have to watch what you think, which is really hard to do. So now what's happening is, just real briefly, as the brain is functioning, it spills over into enhanced autonomic endocrine immune modulation. So a healthy brain makes a healthy immune system, and a healthy immune system makes a healthy brain, and a healthy endocrine system makes a healthy brain. So as you change as the brain becomes healthier, it spills over into other aspects as well. In fact, every time they find a neurotransmitter in the body, like in the late 80s, they would find that the white blood cells have a receptor for it. Not only that, the white blood cell in some cases would make it. So when we hear about neurotransmitter, it's like, well, these are the chemicals we find in the brain, but in essence what's happening is that your body makes neurotransmitters in other parts of your body. So like your small intestines make 90% of your serotonin. So to divide these lines of going, that's purely the nervous system, that's purely the immune system, and that's purely the endocrine system. And I think what you're seeing in this program, what comes at us, is that we're saying, no, those lines are going to be blurred. So as you know, you need fuel and activation. That's what this slide is. We all know about healthy fats. Healthy bacteria probiotics are really important. A lot of practitioners that I know that are very successful will say that if a leaky gut, leaky brain, leaky gut, leaky brain, and I see that to be true. I did one of my papers on probiotics and its effect on the chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia. And what happened with those studies is, I thought when I was doing this, like, oh, it's going to really have a lot to do with inflammation and decrease the centralization of pain and physical, but it wasn't. It was actually these people got better emotionally. Their depression scores lowered because in that population there's a high frequency of depression and anxiety. Probiotics had a direct effect on depression as well as anxiety. That just blew my mind. I was really intrigued by that information. Now, also too, remember activations, mental attitude, mental exercises, movement exercises, and of course chiropractic adjustments. And so all these feed back into that. Get adjusted, I'm telling you guys. If you haven't seen a chiropractor, find someone that you can and just go through that. Find an acupuncturist. Find a mind-body doc. Find these. You go through that process and see how that feels, because you're going to be you have to if you're going to do functional medicine, you have to explore these things, because you may have a patient that has exactly what you had that you didn't think would help with that particular treatment, and it helped. So you got to throw your bodies out there, folks. Pretty easy. Decrease brain activity, lose endocrine modulation and immune modulation. The right brain has a lot to do with toning down the immune system. The left brain has a lot to do with ramping it up. So if you're completely left brain all the time, you may activate your immune system to such a degree you can create autoimmune, just to give you an idea with that. And, promoters of neurodegeneration, this is a real important slide. Lack of stimulation, we already know that. Inflammation, we already know that. Microglial activation, microglial are your immune cells within the brain. If they get stimulated too much, they can cause that. Dysglycemia is probably the most prevalent thing that you will ever see out there. In fact, I would highly recommend that if you're practicing now, if you don't know this already, always suspect it's a blood sugar problem until proven differently. I think that's the biggest thing. If your patients aren't eating breakfast, sorry. If they're having sugar every day, sorry. If they are craving sweets after they have dinner, they have a dysglycemia. If they can't sleep through the night, they have a dysglycemia. If they have any symptoms that happens in the afternoon, headaches, sleepiness, they have their blood sugars off. And the brain is one of the few tissues in the body that cannot rely on fat stores for its energy production. It's completely dependent on the levels of blood sugar. Methylation imbalances we will touch upon. Deficiency of nutrients. As you know, we finally reached a point that, they might be deficient in some nutrient they need, either vitamin or mineral. Of course the patient's not going to be healthy. The body needs these things to process and become efficient. Stress. Mental emotional stress. Hounselier was the one who discovered the adrenal glands. He broke stress down to 4 things. It is physical stress, pain, not sleeping, exertion, chemical, the things the body is exposed to, or the things the body should be exposed to. And most of the stress chemical is what food-like substances that patients eat, and sugar. 2, mental emotional stress. You have to imagine for millions of years we either got eaten or we got away, but we didn't have long sustained deadlines, mortgages, that type of thing. That's really hard on our nervous system. So mental, emotional, and then changes in temperature. So I grew up in Georgia as well, and it's like hotter than heck outside, but then you walk into an air-conditioned building. My body has to release adrenal hormones to regulate that thermal field. So these are all stressors. So as you increase cortisol, your body is being stressed. Okay? So this is a real simple slide. If the brain can't communicate unless there's a neurologic connection and a chemical connection, and I think that's what we talked about. We talked about the nerve connection. We talked about the synapses. That's the chemical connection. These are the 4 at this slide. These are the 4 neurotransmitters that we're going to be covering. And here's how the neurotransmitters are defined. Is here. You can just read that slide. And this is an interesting slide. Here's where the neurotransmitters synthesize. We know it's in the brain, okay, but we also have an autonomic ganglia. We talked about the autonomic ganglia today. The gastrointestinal tract, I told you, the small intestine makes tremendous amounts of serotonin. Your kidneys, your T cells, those are your white blood cells, smooth muscle end organs, and the adrenal medulla. Adrenal medulla makes your epinephrine, norepinephrine, or your adrenaline, as some people know, but it's not quite proper to use adrenaline because that's not really the name of the hormone, but that was named of the trademark of the hormone that was synthesized, but it kind of stuck. Okay? Neurotransmitter classification, there's excitatory and inhibitory, and then they break it down into amines, amino acids, amines, and peptides. Okay? Interesting, serotonin is both excitatory as well as inhibitory, that as well. GABA is the most prevalent neurotransmitter. You're going to be learning about that. Dopamine, acetylcholine. Those are the 4 that we're going to be talking about most. Okay. And then remember I was talking about the methylation. Methylation is really big to setting the patient's body to success. It's also what I would consider sexy because it's kind of, look at this big giant thing here, all these circles and arrows and stuff like this. But here's where I want you to focus on, this BH4. BH4 is the enzyme and cofactor that helps the body turns phenylalanine into tyrosine, and tyrosine is your basic building block for your thyroid hormone, your epinephrine, norepinephrine, your dopa, which is right here, dopamine. Okay. If you can't get that conversion, you're not going to make enough DOPA. So when you find a patient, you do a test, which is, the only tests out there really are urine, but there's a lot of controversy in that. In fact, you're going to be reading those articles this week. A lot of practitioners use questionnaires, and if you suspect that, and you want to chase that down, like where is it in that pathway that it's breaking down, and if you can find that, that's where we want to go. But right here, you need this BH4. Well, BH4 needs methylation. So say you have a patient that's depressed and they have high homocysteine. Well, you want to be able to convert it to methionine, and as you know, you need methylation for that to happen. You need folic acid, B12, and also, you may want to. You got to get to the B6 as well. Okay. So what's happening in this, methylation can affect that BH4, and thereby it'll affect the neurotransmitters right here, which is a real important piece. Now this next slide you'll like because it just breaks it down. Here's your BH4 right here. But see, the BH4 is affected by inflammation. Remember, if you don't fix the inflammation, you cannot fix the patient. You're just basically patching them up. You have to find out where that's coming from. And in my practice, and from people that I talk to and people that I teach, I'd say at least 80% of that, and I'm being conservative, is because of what they're eating every day. Now, the hardest thing in practice is actually getting a patient to change what they eat. So you have to find ways to communicate that to them. And that in itself, you're going to have if you do the psychology of eating, that helps. But this is probably the hardest thing I do in practice, is just is connecting what they eat to what their problem is. But it's also been the thing that's made my practice very successful. So here we go. We're showing you the methylation effects of BH4, and you can see how it affects all this. You got your tyrosine, dopamine, 5-hydroxytryptophan. Hey, that's serotonin and nitrous oxide, which helps the, we know that as a reactive oxygen species. However, it also helps the arteries dilate. Lowers blood pressure. Okay, so that is our first talk. I appreciate your time and energy. Like I said, this is a very fascinating subject. If some of you may feel overwhelmed, I would say don't. Just drop it, take a walk, let it process. The other thing that I highly recommend is, if you have a good friend, neighbor, significant other, is try to, as you do the readings, try to tell them what you learn. You'll be surprised what you know is in there. The only way you know is if you discuss it. So if you learn something about a neurotransmitter or something like that, I want you to find someone and explain it to them what you know. So just pick a subject that you think is complicated or you want to talk about, because the better you're able at communicating these concepts to your patients, the more successful your practice is going to be. It's not about, I've seen really brilliant practitioners out there, and they're very good. But if you lack that ability to communicate to the patients what your concerns are, what you're finding, then you're not gonna have that practice that you deserve. And the patients, and it's just another form of being a good doc. You have to be able to communicate these things to these patients, because that's where you get the changes. So I hope you guys have a great week. I really look forward to teaching in this class. And if anyone wants to donate any information about that, in such a way, either a YouTube video or an article that just seems to kind of make more sense with a complex subject, please post it. That would be great. Until then, we'll see you soon, and have a great week.